Hi, everyone. So glad to see you all in the audience, and I'm excited for this session to follow this first one because the first one was very focused on a number of really critical topics, but a big one being data sharing. Well, to be able to share data, we need to be able to generate data, and generating data requires designing trials that patients can and want to participate in. And sometimes we let perfect get in the way of good enough. And we might be designing trials that we think is going to give us the exact perfect data points that we want, but we forget about the fact that we've got real people with real lives. And where do those lives fit into the trial? Where does the trial fit into their lives? So we'll have a discussion today with this fantastic panel. We've got so many different perspectives to bring to this conversation. And I want to get started just by having each person introduce themselves and tell a little bit about their perspective, what they're bringing to this conversation about trial design. And we'll start, let's start with Lindsay, going out of order here. Please introduce yourself and share kind of what you're bringing to this conversation and what your experience is.
Sure. Thanks, Cheryl. So I'm Lindsay Murray. I'm the Executive Director of the Rare Disease Clinical Outcome Assessment Consortium. And I'm really here. We know clinical trials in pediatric populations are hard for a lot of reasons, but without the understanding of the biophysiology, we have to rely on clinical outcome assessment based endpoints, and that can have some real challenges when you have patient populations that just can't self-report. So you're really relying on these external folks to speak to what is meaningful to these children. And so FDA came to us a number of years ago and said, we know this is a problem, and how can we maybe go about fixing this? And so we've brought together industry and patient advocacy groups and regulators to really talk about how can we reduce some of these barriers? How can we identify clinical outcome assessments that are best suited to use in pediatric clinical trials that have the best chance of showing efficacy with COA-based endpoints?
Thanks, Lindsay. Let's move on to Jean now. Share your experience with clinical trial design and why you're on this panel.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Jean Paty. I'm currently the CEO of a small company called Outcome MD. I was previously with IQVIA. My training is in clinical psychology, and I've been working in the area of developing clinical outcome assessments for more years than I'm going to admit in public. I've been very fortunate to be able to work with FDA, EMA, CPATH, lots of different organizations. And I have always been struck by our inability to, starting with myself, to truly listen to what will work for patients and their families in clinical trials. I think the one lesson that I'm still learning is to listen and to truly listen. And I think that listening is actually not random. I think it's systematic to be able to understand and transform what we hear into something that works for people. And we'll talk more about that as we move along.
Thanks, Sean. Now, Dominique, you're here wearing two hats. Can you tell us about your professional background as well as a bit about your personal story?
Yeah. Thank you so much for the invitation to be here. I'm Dominique Pichard, and I'm the Chief Science Officer at the International Rett Syndrome Foundation. My background is as a physician scientist, and I'm conducting early phase trials across numerous different rare diseases at the NIH. But I also happen to be the parent of a now 18-year-old young woman who lives with a rare neurodevelopmental disorder called Rett syndrome. And I made the decision to kind of merge my professional and my personal lives by joining the International Rett Syndrome Foundation to really help to advance the work that we do in the Rett syndrome field to bring what I know about kind of the challenges with rare disease drug development and this really challenging complex, very heterogeneous neurodevelopmental disorder to really try to advance drug development so that we can get to treatments in a more meaningful way. And one of the things that I learned through my earlier career where I was conducting the clinical trials was really listening to that patient voice. With our daughter, we've participated in many clinical trials. We know what it's like to travel to different states for clinical trials, to have to take 12 trips like in 16 weeks to Boston. And that means taking off work. That means her missing school. That means my other kids have no one at home to be with them during that time, looking for other caretakers to help out and really thinking about what is important to that child who's living with the condition as well as the family unit who's with them. And that really kind of touches on what Julia was saying earlier. How do we look at what's important and what's meaningful? And maybe it is not the outcome assessment that's being used in multiple clinical trials for some common disorder, but maybe it actually has to be a little bit more individualized to what is meaningful to those that are living with the condition in their family unit, because it may not be what you think. And so I merged as I said, my professional and my personal lives to really try to help bring more meaningful and impactful outcomes to the Rett syndrome field and hopefully, spread across to other neurodevelopmental and neurologic diseases as well.
So glad you're here. Thank you. And Adam, I really appreciate you traveling here to DC. I know that leaving home is not easy to do. And so for you to be here physically, for people to be able to chat with afterwards, I'm really glad that you're here. Tell us a little bit about your family story, your son's story, and the journey of getting into trials.
So I'm really, really excited to be here. It's kind of a rare experience for me as a dad, actually, because it's not often I'm asked to do things like this. And I think as a dad, there's this kind of pervasive idea of what a dad is in the support structure of a family. So I think we have Al Bundy to thank for that. So we've had a lot of unique challenges coming up in this. Will was diagnosed around 4 to 6 months, I believe. First seizure at 2 months. And at first it wasn't even classified as a seizure. We went to the doctor and they said, it's just a weird thing babies do. Like, that doesn't seem like a great answer, but okay. So I believe it was within a month of that first incident that he had his first prolonged seizure. And that one, I think, was in the neighborhood of an hour or so. So it was very scary. That was our second child. We have 3 of them at home, but going into that, we've had the follow-up appointment with the neurologist, and the neurologist told us, well, it's pretty scary that he's having these prolonged seizures before 6 months. That's usually nothing good, and he was right. So following on to that, I think we got genetic testing around 4 months, got the results around 5 after several prolonged seizures leading up to that. And I think it was that, we get the initial diagnosis of Dravet syndrome, if anybody's familiar with that. And after you get diagnosed and the doctor that's diagnosing you doesn't know anything about the syndrome. He hands us this packet of papers and says, it was first discovered in France. Well, okay, let's Google it. And you Google it and you see nothing good. It's I think one in 4 children don't make it to adulthood. It's 1 in 18,000, I believe, are diagnosed with it. It's exceedingly rare, complicated to treat, and comes with a lot of challenges, behavioral, physical, mental, and lots of seizures of all types. But if you look at it through the lens of like a silver lining, like we're raising children that are very kind. So, little story. My son was at school, my oldest, Benjamin, and there was a child in his class or close to him that's deaf and hard of hearing and autistic, so nonverbal. So he communicates with sign. He got in the floor and was attempting to communicate with him. And the teacher was telling Casey that was the first time she had seen a child do that. Like, just exceedingly proud of my boy. But our early experience with Dravet syndrome is what drove us to seek out the trials. So another story for you. One of the worst experiences that we had was being picked up by an ambulance, and they didn't listen to they didn't take in mind our consideration of like where we needed to go for him to be treated. He had a 30-minute seizure is pretty scary for somebody responding. So we had told them, hey, he's been seizing for 30 minutes. This isn't abnormal. We need to go to this particular hospital. Well, they took us to the nearest hospital, and that nearest hospital was not equipped for pediatrics. So we're there, hospital's filthy. There's a image burned into my head of a greasy nurse named Dean. Not a fan of Dean. But I remember hearing Dean talking to the doctor, and Dean is saying, we don't have any pediatric equipment to intubate him. And then the doctor responded, if we don't, he's going to die. Wow. So we're sitting there in the hallway. I'm looking down at the floor. It's filthy. And I'm thinking to myself, how do we get past this? How do we provide for our son in the best way that he lives? And we're researching the genetic trials, we're researching different treatment options. And the trouble with Dravet syndrome is that there's not a standard of treatment. It's very rare, and every kid that is diagnosed with it they don't respond the same way to any given medicine. So like the big ones, you have steripental, Epidiolex, and Onfi. 2 of those medicines worked for my son, and the other wasn't as beneficial. So like having those experiences early on and wanting to pursue the best course of treatment for my son, or our son, that pushed us to research these genetic trials and try to get our foot in the door. And we're fortunate to be included in one.
Thank you for sharing those stories. Really glad that you're here and that we get to hear more. We did have a third parent panelist, and she was unable to join because she's sick from travel. She lives in St. Louis, but has to go to Durham, North Carolina for clinical trials for her 2 sons that have Pompe disease. And I hope that we get to have her in a panel in the future. Maybe we can Zoom her in virtually because she had just a really critical experience to share. Her experience was about, Adam, you're talking about all the work that you had to do to figure out what trials, what treatment options there were and what trials even looked like. For her, it was about how to care for her kids at home outside of the trial setting. And her background is not in healthcare or medicine, but she had to figure out how to do nursing care at home on her own. And the thing that I wanted to share about one of the challenges that she's had in the last month that has contributed to her not being here is that she's in a trial, and if there are challenges to the infusion in the trial of the study drug that happen after she leaves the site, it becomes the responsibility of the patient, not the trial. But to seek care, the person writing the order for the administration, the infusion, has to be the person referring. And before they got into the trial, they had questions about, well, how is this going to go? Is this the trial site that has to do this? Is it our home doctor? And they didn't actually get the answers that were helpful. And so these questions are still unanswered to her. And she's actively trying to care for 2 kids while juggling her family. She has a third child, and just, life goes on even though you're in a trial. And you can't separate those 2 things. And I think that her story, hopefully we'll get to feature it at some point because it's really important in this conversation. So speaking of trial design, I want to go to Jean now. You've been helping sponsors design and implement clinical trials for a long time. So what have you heard or seen that explains kind of these barriers that we're exploring today about trial participation?
Well, I think the anecdote you just gave and Adam's stories are, there's so much that comes before the actual involvement in the trial. And one of the things that I've noticed, and again, I'm starting with myself, holding myself accountable. I was involved in a program, I won't speak about the details, but it was a pediatric rare condition. And the primary symptom was pruritus. And 2 interesting components. And I think this speaks to us truly trying to learn. One was the company initially wanted to use a biomarker to evaluate the treatment. And actually, we did a meeting with FDA. And the first thing the FDA folks said was, well, perhaps the biomarker might shift, but how do we actually know that the treatment worked? And unless we have evidence that pruritus has changed, we don't believe that we have a clear indication of treatment benefit. And this was, the company was taken aback and wanted to really fight the FDA on this. And it was one of those things where when we started to actually then speak to the parents, listen to the parents of these children, it was very clear and obvious that this was so bad. I mean, these children would, and their babies would scratch themselves, they'd bleed, they would not be sleeping at night, etc. And it became clear that that's what we had to listen to. And so eventually we got there. But I feel like this is where we as researchers really let people down, to be perfectly honest. And I go back to what I said before. Through the process of doing systematic interviews with patients, and in this case, caregivers, we've started to learn to really listen to what matters. I know we espouse this, etc., but we actually don't necessarily do it. And it's not just measuring, it's also the nature of the trials. I told the team this anecdote. So now in a number of companies, one must check the box that one has spoken to X number of patients or patient advocates, etc. And literally somebody came to me one time and said, okay, working with this company, we've come up with a structured interview. And one of the questions was, if you had a choice between 3 colonoscopies or 5 colonoscopies, what would you choose? This was real. I said, did you really ask that to people? It's like, yeah, they're trying to design the trial and figure out. I said, well, what do you think most people are going to say? First of all, they're going to start with 0, right? And again, yes, there might be trials where we have to do colonoscopies. I'm not sure why we're asking such a thing. perhaps we need to ask about something like, what do you think that experience is going to be like? What can we do to facilitate the process? What can we do to, we have to get this test done. It probably has to be at this frequency. Help us come up with something that perhaps people like yourself who are experiencing this can make it through this. So I really feel like there's so much for us to learn, but it's not just, someone said it the other day, it's not trying to make Adam a clinical trialist. It's actually just sitting down, plain and simple, and saying, hey, we're going to do this. Do you mind collaborating with us? And I'm sorry, Amila's mom, who spoke earlier, it's been my experience as well that you give folks this opportunity, and 9.9 times out of 10, they're going to take you up on it. So I'm going to say it at least 20 more times before we're done. For me, it's a listening exercise. Probably the greatest irony for me is I'm a trained clinical psychologist, and I really didn't learn how to listen. Oh, my spouse will probably argue that's still a work in progress, but I'm going to claim that in the last 10 years, I've made some progress.
Known you a long time, Jean. I think you're coming along.
I'm coming along.
Lindsay, let's turn to you now. You sit in this unique situation at CPATH where, as a neutral body, you get to speak to regulators and advocacy groups and sponsors, and you see all the different pieces of the puzzle. Can you identify kind of where the disconnect might be in terms of trial design and really making trials more accessible?
I mean, so certainly from my interactions with a number of patient advocacy groups, the thing I hear most frequently is they're not measuring what matters to us. And sometimes that's for a reason. And sometimes what families find really important, we don't measure well in clinical trials. And so sometimes there is that disconnect, and there has to be. And in those cases, I think sponsors need to do a much better job of working with their patient populations so that they understand why they can't measure the thing that's so important to these families. But maybe they can collaborate then on finding other outcomes that we can measure in a clinical trial setting that won't take 10 years to move, and find out what are these other things that are really important to the patient communities. And I think a lot of what I've seen and what I've heard is that, John, you were talking about, it's a checkbox, and I have seen that come up again and again in my discussions with patient advocates. Is they're brought in at the very end of a trial to check that box and say, so sponsors can say, well, look, we talked to patients about this, we talked to advocates about this, and they get to the end of the trial, they've already run everything, and the advocacy patient, says none of this matters to us. It's not about reducing the number of seizures. It was about gaining function, having a child be able to, participate and interact with their family members, and that wasn't measured. So there's a real disconnect there, which has, I think, really serious consequences for when you see a drug trial that fails. We don't know why it failed. Did it fail because the drug didn't work, or did it fail because we picked the wrong outcomes and think we're not measuring what we should have been measuring? And a lot of these diseases, they're very small. You have very small patient populations, but it can disincentivize other sponsors to come into that space because they see failed trials. And that's really tragic for those patient communities. We need to be doing a better job of making it easier to work within a patient population and then see are treatments actually working, and make it more attractive than to do subsequent trials in these populations if the trial doesn't work for some reason.
Thanks, Lindsay. Adam, we've spoken a few times, and you've shared some of the aspects of your trial experience. And I think that Lindsay just hit on one of the things that you shared with me. So would you like to comment about the experience you've had and the things that are measured in the trial and kind of how that's landed with you?
Oh, yeah. So I can't tell you how emotionally exhausting it is going into these trials. That there's a lot that goes into it. You know, we're traveling, in my situation, we're traveling 5 hours to get to Chicago to participate in this particular trial. But the questions they ask, they are challenging. You have, I have Will, who's 7 years old, cognitively around 14 months or so, nonverbal, autistic, sort of wrapped into one. So we're being asked questions like, can he cross the street unassisted? Can he jump rope? Can he ride a bike? Like, no, he cannot do any of those things. And it's likely that he will never be able to do any of those things. It would be a miracle if he ever got to that point. However, there are patients within the community that could foreseeably be on that spectrum somewhere. The Dravet syndrome in particular, it's a very broad spectrum. We have the severely affected, like Will, and then on the far right of the spectrum, we have one child that I know of that has graduated high school and is doing really well. It's incredible. She still has seizures, but she's somewhat not as severely affected. But going into these trials, and they have the history of my son. So asking these questions repeatedly throughout the course of the trial, it's emotionally draining. It's a morning block of about 3 hours where the doctor's interviewing me, asking these questions, and I would rather not if I could.
Is there something about, Lindsay mentioned kind of making sure that people were informed and why the questions are being asked. And is there anything that you can point to that could make that better for you?
That's challenging. And I think it's challenging because I know why they're asking the questions. Like I know they need to get that broad spectrum of data to see across the board how these children are progressing. But at the same time, with a child like my son, I don't know how they're getting usable data from the questions that they're asking, because it's not showing progress. He's stayed fairly stagnant in the development where he's at right now. Having a disclaimer, which I have few complaints about the trial that we're in, because they're very personable. They're very upfront about the tests they're running and how much data they're able to share. They're actually a great team, but it's hard to say if they gave a disclaimer up front, if it would change my perspective on that or not. I'm not sure.
Okay.
To be honest.
Yeah, thanks. I realize I put you on the spot there, so thanks for exploring that. I realize I didn't actually introduce myself. I'm the Vice President of the Clinical Outcome Assessment Program at CPATH. So my role at CPATH and my career has been developing these measures that are being used in trials. And I'm just thinking here, what could I do as a measurement expert? How could I make that better? And there are certainly things that the measurement folks could be doing that could then keep those items from being administered if they're really inappropriate. There could be kind of gatekeeping items where if RJ, I know you're shaking your head, RJ is a psychometrician, and we were talking about computerized adaptive testing last night, where immediately you can know, okay, based on this first response, what would be an appropriate question for this person? And if they're not mobile, don't ask them questions about mobility. Focus on the things that they can do and get some good measurement in that area. So there are options. It's not all on the site. We do have some responsibility as well. So Dominique, let's talk about maybe things that you've seen that people are doing right. Jean mentioned, if we had actually spoken to some people, we would know that we shouldn't have asked this question, or we should have asked it in a different way. Do you have examples of where things are going well in trial design?
Absolutely. And I've really seen this evolve over the last decade, at least in neurodevelopmental disorders, where the checkbox has become less of a checkbox and more of a kind of true, meaningful interaction. And I think it's because people have seen, as we've heard, that when that checkbox comes too late and doesn't have meaning, it really impacts your trial. And so I've seen two different kind of ways in which it's been meaningful interaction that's helped the trial design. So we've had sponsors that have come to us as the advocacy organization to say, we want you to help us put together a panel of families who can give us input early before that they've actually submitted their trial to the FDA, for the IND. So getting that meaningful patient interaction early on, and really the ones that have been done the best are ones that actually have a third party that helps to moderate this. Someone that can help the sponsor listen to the right things and try to really gain that information from the families. And what we've seen is they've learned how challenging it is to travel for the families with Rett syndrome. What it would mean to relocate for 3 months, what would they actually need to make that possible? And it's not that the trial was like, oh yeah, sure, we won't make them relocate. But instead they said, we heard what you need and we have built that in as a support so that when they are learning about the trial opportunity, they are also hearing, these are the things that we will build in to make it easier for you to participate in this trial. They've also listened to what is meaningful. And some of the outcome assessment tools that have been used in other trials do not get to what is meaningful. And so how can we look at what else there is? And I'll give an example. In Rett syndrome, individuals are nonverbal. And parents across the board say, I just want to hear my kids say, Mom, I love you. I'm crying because my stomach hurts. Not because I'm cold, not because I'm hungry, not because I want to go to sleep, not because I want Barney on, like my stomach hurts. But taking a nonverbal 18-year-old and expecting that in 12 weeks' time, they're going to be saying, Mom, my stomach hurts because the food you gave me, is unrealistic. But maybe it's meaningful to have that nonverbal individual who uses an eye gaze device be able to use it more easily. That would be meaningful. It's not that you have to get to, the perfect. Good enough is being able to use the tools that we have to allow them to communicate. So the sponsors learn that and then look for what tools can help us measure that. So if we can't say, okay, a developmental scale that gets to final communication. So that's one way that sponsors have really been doing that listening, and we've seen those positive impacts in the trials. The other thing that I had started within the Rett syndrome community is a clinical trial community, a clinical trial committee. And this really got to the point that you brought up, Lindsay, is that we have numerous clinical trials. And I didn't want us to have trials that failed for the wrong reasons. As Lindsay mentioned, I didn't want it to be because participants didn't enroll, because the burdens were too high, or, the outcome assessments that they were using were not meaningful. They were asking about, did your kid cross the street when our kids are in wheelchairs, right? And so we built this clinical trial committee that includes key opinion leaders as well as family members, so that they can give input to the trial design. So it really is kind of a comprehensive feedback to sponsors. And we've seen, again, really meaningful change to the trials, to the protocols, when the sponsors bring them to us early enough and get that input. And I think that it ultimately is having a positive impact on the Rett syndrome trials.
Thank you. I was really excited to hear that from Dominique when we were planning this session. And it made me think, well, at what point does it become you're asking too much of the parents and the families in designing the trials? You're asking them to do the work. You need their voice, but you're also asking a lot of them. And the way that I got in touch with Dominique is I saw one of her colleagues, Paige Nuez, speak at a conference earlier this year. And that conference, the session she was in was about qualitative data. So the things that we've touched on already in terms of good measurement and good trial design. But in this session, she was advocating for data sharing of qualitative data. So we've already talked about data sharing. You're going to hear that continuously over the next 3 days, because that is the secret. It's the power to what it is that we're able to accomplish as researchers. But qualitative data sharing is something that really doesn't happen very often. And it's something that we need to be doing, because if interviews have been done in a patient population or in with caregivers, and there's information about what's meaningful, about what the barriers are to trial participation, things like that might have already been, that group might have already provided that information. And if we can share the data to be able to find that out, then other sponsors wouldn't have to pull those groups back together and take time out of their family lives to ask the same questions that they've already been asked. We might actually have a data source that could tell us that information, and then the trials could be better informed from that information. So not just quantitative data sharing, qualitative data sharing as well. And that also includes making sure that you've got the right consent for the data to be shared when those participants are entering the study. So just planting those seeds. If you're going out and doing that type of work yourself, please think about who can use that information in the future. So coming back to the panel. Oh,
Just come on to
John,
that real quick.
please.
So one of the nice things that's happened is a lot of journals have actually started to open up and publish qualitative data, which was not the case 5, 7, 10 years ago. And we've been quite successful in that happening. And I would, as a general suggestion, I would say, one, I think we need to ensure, like you said, you have the appropriate consents, et cetera. But I would highly encourage us to increase the rate at which we're sharing that information. It's nice that there are vehicles to do so now.
Mhm. Thanks. Adam, I want to come back to you. You just have so much to learn. We all have so much to learn from your story. Just about the trial participation, what is something, you said that you happen to be in a really good, solid one, but I'm sure there are things that could still be improved that would help your life, your family's life, just the integration of this trial into your personal life. Do you have any ideas there that you could share?
Yeah, some flexibility with logistics. So we're pretty geographically separated from our trial site. We can get there by car, but there's some issues getting there. You know, like my mom, for example, goes to Chicago with me whenever we do our trips. There's been trips that she hasn't been able to go with me, and wow, was that challenging. So like one time in particular, I was driving up there, and in the course of the trip, he had 3 different seizures. So, you know, we're going up I-55 and pulling off to address a seizure 2 different times before we get to Chicago. And I don't know if anybody in here's driven in Chicago, but it's a very stressful situation at the best of times. So if you have a 6-year-old in the backseat having a seizure while you're driving around in Chicago, that's even more challenging. And also people in large cities mind their business like it's their job. So I had pulled off the road, got Will out of the seat, put him on the tailgate of the truck, and was trying to stabilize him during a seizure. I left the rescue medicine in the truck. So I have all these passerbys on the sidewalk just shooting past me. Nobody's paying me any mind. So then I just grabbed somebody. I'm like, you stand here and hold him so I can get his medicine. It's like, oh, okay. So he came up, held Will so I could get his medicine, stabilize him. But that flexibility in logistics keeps stuff like that from happening. Like we have St. Louis Children's Hospital that is now a trial site, but I can't go to that trial site because we were already enrolled in Chicago. So yeah, it would make our lives tremendously easier, but alas, that's not the case. We're happy to make that trip because we've seen the progress that Will's making, but it would make our lives a whole lot easier if we were able to switch sites, or even if they were able to administer the medication and submit the results to Chicago. You know, like that's logically, that seems like something that could be done, but that's not something they're doing in this trial.
Threaten to drop out.
Pardon?
threaten to drop out of the trial. Sorry,
Yeah, I won't do that.
I say that out loud.
Yeah. And unfortunately, they hold a lot of cards with us because we are seeing the progress and we don't want to risk messing up that relationship.
I'm saying that a little facetiously, but I do think that being on the receiving side of this, I would encourage you to not be afraid to tell those of us that are making those decisions to listen a little bit more carefully to you. Seriously.
That is a consideration.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I've heard I've heard a lot about sponsors moving to lean protocols where only the most necessary assessments are made, which is certainly a good idea. And I think that's in line with what we're hearing here. Don't ask questions that are not necessary or inappropriate. But in this case, it's common sense protocols. It's a protocol that needs to have some sort of flexibility to allow for the human to be considered and not just the subject. I use that term in quotes because it's still a word that we use, and it's, I think, very far from where our hearts are. And those of us that are close to research, we know that even though we're working with data points that provide so much information, each of those data points is a human that has a story, and we're only getting a little glimmer of what their lives are like. Lindsay, kind of same question to you. What have you heard from the community that you work with on things that could facilitate trial participation?
I think what Dominique was mentioning, coming early to the groups, I was listening to the Duke Margolis workshop last week on small trials, small populations and rare diseases. And there was a sponsor there who admitted, I don't include the patient groups early because I kind of assume that they're not going to be able to provide us with useful information. And, on the one hand, I'm horrified. And on the other hand, I'm glad she said it because I'm sure she's not alone in thinking that. And so it was a really revealing thing that's like, well, this is a problem we have with sponsors. We need to be doing a better job of educating sponsors. And, I really feel like even in the last 5 years, I've seen the patient advocates groups become much more sophisticated. And I think really are capable of, as your group is doing, helping with the trial designs, helping be there from the beginning, and not getting left behind until the end. And I think that, as you all have said, that makes a huge difference in how you're willing to participate in a trial, because you're not being asked to move somewhere for 3 months with no support system, because you're not going to answer questions that are meaningless to you. So there's a lot of work to be done here, but there are people making those efforts, and we're starting to see, I think, some turnover in the assumptions that are being made by clinical trialists and sponsors about what the patient groups can really contribute. And I'm seeing more and more of the patient groups demanding that their considerations be a part of that, development program.
Can I jump in on that? And this is really kind of blending a little bit of what's been said throughout this session is, sometimes you don't have the benefit of kind of the International Rett Syndrome Foundation that has an experienced trialist that is leading the CTC, or even kind of the organization of the population. But listening, right? You don't have to necessarily have a sophisticated patient group. People that live with the disease are sophisticated in what that disease means to them. And knowing how to ask the questions is more important than, do you have a group that can bring together 20 sophisticated patients that can help us design our trial? It's really about talking to, maybe it's the clinicians that are treating these individuals with a said disease that might be able to, help connect you to people living with the disease if there isn't some organization. And then having someone on the team that knows how to ask questions to be able and knows how to listen, I think could be really valuable when you don't have the benefit of organized groups.
It's just that simple, just listening. I do want to open it up for questions from the audience. And normally I would only want to have questions. Oh yes, we've got some people up here. But if you also have experience where you've implemented something that has been successful, or if you are in a patient group that you've seen something work, would love to hear from you as well in this conversation. So Maurizio, oh, we've got several up here.
Yeah, hi.
Micro-
I'm interested in knowing, this question is for Adam and for Dominique. I work in pediatric rare disease clinical trials, and one of the things that I think is successful is the idea of doing remote assessments, sometimes using a video format, or sometimes administering a questionnaire over the phone. And I was just interested to know if that's anything that either one of you have experience doing, or if that is of interest to you. Like, would that be acceptable? Thanks.
Adam, do you want to start?
So in the design of ours, we haven't experienced any remote sort of communication. And taking it at face value, I think I don't know that I would prefer one over the other. I guess if the questions are well designed, then sure, that'd be a great option.
And I would say both from kind of experience in clinical trials as well as running clinical trials, as much as you can make it hybrid, if it can't be truly decentralized, the parts that can be done at home, can you get your blood draws locally? Can you get your EKGs locally? And I know there are significant challenges that go into that. Can you do your caregiver reported outcomes on your phone at home, or on your laptop at home, or on a piece of paper at home, and bring it in next clinic? I think that is invaluable because it decreases the burden when you're at that visit. When you're at that visit and your child is seizing and you're being asked to fill out 15 caregiver reported outcomes that are, for the most part, meaningless to you. If you're able to do it in the comfort of your home, or where you've got your partner or caretaker system, I think it
had to be, sorry. And if it had to be not just like on your own schedule, filling out a paper, but even an appointment where over the phone you're doing an interview-based caregiver report, that still would be better than sitting in, at your clinical trial visit while your child is having whatever challenges they're having. Is that what you're saying?
absolutely.
Okay,
And I
fair.
think COVID taught us
Appreciate that.
a lot of that, not only
100%.
for our clinical trials, but for telehealth,
Yeah.
for our regular medical, that you're like,
Yeah.
oh, I don't actually have to go and drive to the hospital and battle the parking or battle Chicago traffic. I can sit at home
Yeah.
and have a video conference with the trial doctor.
This is great. Thank you very much, Adam. Yeah.
And another note on that, just to kind of footstop what you said too, with the hybrid design, there's a lot of tests, blood work, different things that Will is subjected to from his normal appointments too. So if there's a way that we could combine those, we're drawing blood once, but he's getting the labs that his regular doctor needs and the clinical trial needs. So
Thank you. Thank
yeah,
you.
that hybrid structure would be fantastic.
I wanted to ask a question that was based on, I think, the last set of comments before we opened it up to questions about bringing in the patient view, which I think is extremely important. But I've seen a lot of clinical trials get designed over the years, and I think most sponsors are so focused on what the regulators will accept. That is their first focus. But then there's the patient groups, which often know more about the disease than anyone. There's, if you have a partner, like a big pharma partner or a small biotech partner, they have their input, which is not always correct, but can be defining. And sort of like figuring out how to put all of that together into an approved trial design is not always easy, and you don't always get the best trial design as a result of doing that.
That's the magic or the
there's
art.
Do we have time for one more question or?
We have technically 5 minutes, but my clock says 10 minutes, so we're going to go with the clock.
Okay.
We're-
Yeah, hi, Karen Lavery. I work for Giving Strength, which is a very small family foundation for a rare monogenic disease. I'm curious how, I have 1,000 questions and I hope that I can catch all of you at some of the networking breaks, but I'm curious if you have any suggestions on how best to incorporate family and patient feedback into trial design for very slowly progressing diseases, which, as Adam mentioned, some of these diseases have a very broad spectrum of phenotypes. So, these families have a genetic diagnosis, but they really don't know the trajectory that their children are going to take. And so I think it's challenging for families to say what they would like to see from the trial. So I'm curious if you have any suggestions on, how best to incorporate community feedback.
John, you want to start?
This is one of the wonderful things that I see happening is we're trying to intervene earlier. And in addition to what you mentioned, slow progressing trials, but also trying to get earlier and earlier into the disease process. We are fundamentally built, most of our study designs are built to see people get better, not to actually not to observe carefully people not getting worse. So we're actually working a lot now to try to understand, what does it look like? How do you look now? How does that compare to an appropriate group? And how do we keep you that way? And so one of the things I think it would be really interesting to continue to explore is for us to learn and listen from the patients and caregivers. What are the things about who the child or adult is right now that are of value? And we look to maintain those over time. So it's a whole different way of thinking about measurement. And I'd say we're early in the process.
I would also add that, we talked about data sharing earlier. This is another data point, right? Learning from others who have similarities, right? So there are other conditions that are small population, very heterogeneous disease, maybe less well understood natural history. And it's being at meetings and connecting with others who have like conditions for trial success, and learning from them and talking about it. When you have successes and failures, talking about both, because that's how we learn. Many of the things that I've implemented at our foundation wasn't because I just had some brilliant light bulb. It's because I pilfered from what others are doing and said, oh, this makes sense for us. This makes sense for us.
Great advice.
If there are other questions, if you're able to, if you can stand up so we don't miss you and the channel can know where you're going.
Oh, this is a popular one. I'm Penny Dex with the Association for Frontotemporal Degeneration, or FTD. And so FTD, like Rett syndrome and Dravet, is a rare disease. We are adult onset and extremely heterogeneous as well. And as Adam said really, really clearly, the questions that might get asked from one family are not going to resonate with the next, or it might be on the stage of disease. So we might have family members that are struggling with communication versus behavior versus motor problems. And as the disease progresses, eventually everyone's going to lose function and die. So what we're finding right now, we've done a lot of listening to our community members and our family members about what matters most to them. And it varies so widely, even within a given clinical spectrum. And it then creates a real challenge with designing these clinical trials in a way that is powered for a rare disease. And one of the things that some of the researchers in our space are really trying to push for is a measurement that is not just, can this person communicate or not, walk or not, eat for themselves or not. But what is their disease stage? Because at the end of the day, that often matters immensely for most of these, certainly the neurological conditions that are all progressive for the most part. So I would love to just hear a reflection on the approaches with these types of outcome measures that might be distilled down into time saved or disease stage, depending on if it's progressive or not. Because how can those things be kind of statistically pulled together into something coherent for a trial, but then pulled back to what matters fundamentally to somebody, which might be, I have an extra 2 years with my loved one. Thank you.
Thank you, Penny. Any reactions to that?
So I feel like I've seen more trials that are, rather than, trying to see a p-value, they're looking at time to event because there are differences. And so potentially you have different events that can be defined and getting at that more like extension of current stability or lack of progression. I think is one way that we can kind of start looking at things a little bit differently.
We're also starting to develop different names, idiosyncratic or personalized endpoints, where you actually design an endpoint around a specific person, and then you measure what's happening with them. And then there are ways to potentially look at their progression or the lack thereof and compare that across other people. So it's a little bit still in early stages, but I think that especially with heterogeneous conditions, this is something we're looking at, both small sample size, but also the heterogeneity.
All right, we're down to 4 minutes on my clock. We've got 3 more questions that I can identify. We'll start with Maurizio.
Try to be super quick. I'm glad that you set the stage for some of the neurological disorders and different presentations. I hear and I completely agree, getting feedback from the patients and understanding what matters to them. How about education to the patients? And I give you a perfect example. The ethics committee told us you're doing too many lumbar punctures in your study, but the only marker that we're looking for is something that you find in the CSF. And that is a burden for patients. Definitely is a burden for patients. So we hear from them that is a burden, and we hear from the ethics committee that we should remove some of those assessments. But then again, regulations or something that you try to associate with the disease progression or with the mechanism of action is only found there. How can we reconcile that part? And I think is a lot of education towards making patients understand why is that important. So can we leverage the same mechanism? Yes, we're learning from you, we are hearing from you, but we also educate you on why it's important.
100%. I think that education is critical. And whether it's education about, a particular protocol, or maybe, the CSF biomarker is going to be relevant across all protocols, or even just the patient community needs to know the difference between clinical care and a clinical trial, and I think that is where, when you do have organized patient groups, that is something that they can take on, and certainly something that we do. We make our patients Rett research ready because we want our patients, our families, we want them to be able to be meaningful participants in these trials, and they need to understand it. So we try to take that burden of any given protocol, because I say that our community is vulnerable because they all want that magic 4-letter word, cure. And if you kind of dangle, like you might get a cure, then they're like, I can't even hear what the risks are. All I can hear is my child is going to be, running down the street and yelling mommy. And so that education is really critical on multiple fronts. And I think in particular about when a trial has I'm going to call it a high burden on a family, that's important to be able to get them to want to enroll and stay in the trial so that you get your data points.
Let's go to our second to last question.
Hi, I'm Jillian. I am from the Galactosemia Foundation. We're like a mom and pop. My daughter's been in a drug trial since 2020. We were on placebo for 2 years. We have other industry partners coming in with new treatment, and early trial design is extremely important. And I have taken on 2 registries in the last year. I've taken on all these different hats to make sure that when we go, our patient experiences are validated. But there is such a disconnect between our regulators need this, industry needs this for regulators, and then the patient voice. How can we center the patient voice first? Because even with our adult population, I'm a nurse, ICU nurse. I do a head-to-toe assessment. I meet all of our patients. Even though my daughter's 8, I take and learn everything I possibly can about our population. When I ask him, what do you want? What would you like with your disease? I'd like to go out on a date. That's his experience as a nurse, like, and this is medical, different from research. I get the whole. When I look at him, he has apraxia of speech, neurological tremors, neurological walking, all these things. And that's important too. But how do we get the patient voice in? Because I don't feel heard, and I've really, really have tried. And I've tried to engage with the FDA that my daughter's voice, the patient's voice matters. We need this, but if we don't have it, how can you set up any trial ethically to be successful? I don't believe, like, and that's, we're having these trials come up. How can we ethically put people through trials that aren't set up for success in rare disease? And we're ultra rare. Our disease population that participated in this was 50 patients. And we travel every 6 months to Atlanta. And now we're in expanded access. And the industry partner is so flexible. And when it comes to CSF, I'm sorry, there's so many things that my daughter has another condition and she had to have brain surgery. And no mom wants to have to tissue bank your daughter's brain to get a biomarker. And I'm so angry because I know that our biomarkers work, but I know the worth of CSF fluid. And so when I say, like, we're participating, we're there, please include us. When are we going to be a third party? I want to be part of it. And I really don't think that it's ethical to set anybody into a drug trial without having their deep insight on this. We're a lot more educated than I think a lot of people get or invested. I'm invested from pregnancy, from IVF, all the way to our aging adults. Like, our oldest adult is 64 and they matter to me. So I'm sorry, I'm like on the thing, but you guys are my people. I need this, and I'm so glad that you're sharing. So thank you. Sorry.
We are over time, but if there are any quick reactions, I don't want to put you on the spot. Oh, Adam, yeah, please.
So whenever, like, you talk about the placebos in these, like, so my son's condition, he does a spinal infusion for how it's delivered. And whenever we enrolled, there was no placebo at that time for the stage of trial that he was in. But the stage of trial they're in now, there is a placebo. And you're willing to take that risk because you want that outcome. And if you're enrolled in that trial, like, there needs to be exemptions to certain things, like particularly a placebo, because, like, I was talking to somebody earlier, like, you have the natural history of the progression of the disease. You have what a typical child is experiencing throughout their treatment. Why do you need a placebo? Like, you're delivering the medicine, you're studying that child, you're like, what benefit do you get from having a placebo in that stage of the trial? It doesn't seem ethical. It doesn't seem like something that is beneficial to the patient or the study as a whole. So that, if there was one thing I wish all of you could take away, or whoever's designing this, would be the placebo exemption for certain things, if it's applicable.
Thanks, Adam. Please, Janet.
Janet Woodcock. I've been working with the Haystack Project on these issues, and back to the frontotemporal dementia, particularly for rare diseases that are heterogeneous. The RCT is not the right tool.
Mhm.
people need to get over it and understand that mathematically, RCT is not going to work when you have a heterogeneous disease, particularly slower progression, and you can't randomize that many patients. What they use the placebo for is what's called causal inference. They want to make sure that whatever benefit they see is caused by the intervention, okay? Not by placebo effect, endorphins and so forth. But there are other ways to do this. And that's why in the prior session, I have really urged looking at the science of self-controlled trials before and after, maybe with the external control of the natural history if you have a decent database. But I do believe, I agree with what was said earlier, that people are, the companies will sort of do what the regulators ask them to do. And I don't think the regulatory authorities have come to grips with the fact that the RCT is not the right tool to use in these small populations. And therefore, I believe, I'm not really taking an advocacy position. This is a mathematical position, right? It's just a mathematical fact, right? That you're going to usually fail, okay? Even if your intervention works, okay? And then people abandon the program because it's a small disease. And we've heard this story over and over again. So, you can sometimes use placebo as a run-in, okay, or open placebo, which can perhaps eliminate some of the placebo effect. There are other ways, but really what we need to do, and I think the community needs to take the lead, is study the science of self-controlled interventions. How do you determine causal inference under those? In other words, how can it be persuasive? You've helped a person, right? When you don't compare means to a placebo, but if you think about it, you have 20 patients, this arm, 20 in the other, they're all heterogeneous. You're going to compare their two averages, unless you have a cure, you're not going to find anything. So I really do think that the community ought to take a stronger stance on this. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, everyone, for your patience. We're going to be adding the Oscars walk-off music for next year to get me off stage on time. But I really appreciate you giving extra time to this panel for this critical conversation. Thank you all.
Thank you guys for bearing with us. That was such a great, engaging conversation. We just wanted to keep it going a little bit longer. So we are going to shorten the break just a touch, but we are going out to a break now. So there are some beverages and things in the hallway. We will bring you back in right around 11 o'clock, maybe just a few minutes after. One thing I wanted to let people know, some people were asking about agendas. We do have printed agendas out in the registration desk, but also if you look at your name badge, there's a QR code here. If you scan this QR code, it gives you the agenda and gives you all the information about today's meeting. So you have that at your fingertips. Please enjoy the networking break, and we'll see you back here in about 20 minutes.